Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm interviewing Fergus McNeill on his work on a project called Distant Voices, Coming Home. But first, let me introduce Fergus. Fergus McNeill is Professor of Criminology and Social Work at the University of Glasgow, where he works in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research and Sociology. Good to know is that prior to becoming an academic in 1998, Fergus worked for a decade in residential drug rehabilitation and as a criminal justice social worker. His many research projects and publications have examined institutions, cultures, and practices of punishment and rehabilitation and their alternatives. Some of his publications you will find on the CP website. And good to know is that Fergus is a respected board member of CP. But currently, Fergus is working on Distant Voices Coming Home, which is a major multi-partner 3-year project exploring reintegration after punishment through creative practices and research methods. And as I understood, it has a lot to do with songwriting and sharing. Fergus, can you tell me about the origins and developments of the Distant Voices project?
I can. And actually the project now is almost 5 years old, thanks to COVID-related delays. So we've been hard at work for a long time. The project began or was stimulated by predecessor research projects which had looked at desistance and about trying to change probation practice and criminal justice more broadly to better support desistance. And one of the key messages that emerged out of those earlier projects concerned social reaction to people returning from sanctions. So people coming out of prison or people coming off of supervision. And there's plenty of evidence about the many barriers that they face, structural barriers, stigmatization, problems of material deprivation, lots of problems. And we were struck by the fact that in the global conversation about rehabilitation and practices that seek to support it, so much of the emphasis is placed on the individual and their transformation. And perhaps the social context in which people attempt to desist and to reintegrate after punishment is understudied comparatively. So we set out to try to engage with and address the social context of re-entry and reintegration using creative methods. And Distant Voices has been doing that for 5 years, and even a few years previously when we piloted aspects of our methodology. Maybe I should go on and just say a little bit more about that methodology. So in the project, we seek to blur the boundaries between creative practices, research, knowledge exchange, and public engagement, and to do all of those things simultaneously. So in respect of creative practices, we've used songwriting as a way to explore human experience in and around criminal justice, but also as a way for people to connect in their discussion of those experiences and to build new relationships. And so we've been almost accidentally practicing reintegration through collaborative songwriting at the same time as we've been exploring people's experiences of crime, punishment, and reintegration. And we take the songs into public contexts, sometimes very large festivals and events, sometimes very small and intimate house gigs, so that the experiences of the people who co-write the songs are explored and discussed with the widest possible range of people. And the people who are the co-writers range from people who've been in prison or subject to probation, or who are currently being supervised in the community, or who work in those systems in prisons or probation, or who have suffered victimization, or who are families of people affected by questions of crime and punishment. So we've worked with all of those different groups to explore their experiences through songwriting, and then we've used the songs as a medium for public communication.
Okay, and what would you highlight are the main learning to arise from it?
Yeah, the project has really in spite of the fact that I've been in the criminal justice system or studying it for more than 30 years, the project has impacted on me quite profoundly. In the first place, I think it has really deepened my understanding of how the experience of criminal justice is felt by people. So the subjective dimension of what it is to be put through penal processes comes out much more powerfully when expressed through artistic means. So that's been one big part of the learning. I think I've learned a lot more about how people feel as if their stories, their experiences, their histories are simplified, flattened, and distorted by criminal justice processing. And then how punishment alienates, marginalizes, and excludes people. I think my sense of how that feels is much more attuned, much more developed as a result of working with creative practices. But on the more positive side, I think I've also learned a huge amount about how relationships that are solidaristic are created through co-creation. In this project, that's co-creation of art in the form of song, but it's also co-creation of community. Many of the people that are involved with the project in short-term songwriting sessions also choose to stay connected with us in a community that we call Unbound, and which meets weekly in Glasgow to share food, to make music, but also more generally to be interested in one another's lives. And those practices of community building, I think, have a lot to teach us in the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Talking about community, CP is probation.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the most important message for probation organizations arising from the project? And elaborating on that, which festival events will be the most relevant for probation organizations?
Well, I think if you pick up the two main messages that I mentioned, mm-hmm. One thing that people could engage with from the probation perspective is to confront what the songs tell us about this experience of being or feeling flattened, distorted, simplified, marginalized, excluded, and alienated, to really study that experience and allow yourself as a probation officer to feel it through the music that's been created, and then ask the question, what can we do to reduce that feeling? How can we work with people in ways which don't produce that effect and which create the constructive, supportive, effective relationships on which we know good probation practice depends? So I think using the music to understand the felt experience of people subject to criminal justice could be very valuable for probation officers. But secondly, with respect to the community building dimension, I think the broader message of the project is that probation itself can't reintegrate people. It can support their reintegration. It can prepare them for reintegration. It can, to some extent, clear some of the barriers that stand in the way of reintegration, but it can only do so effectively through engaging with communities. Yeah. And through working to build communities that have the characteristics that we've been studying, characteristics associated with social solidarity. So I think if I was coming to this festival as a probation officer, I would come with those two agendas. What can I learn from this about how people experience criminal justice? And what can I learn about how community has been built through these practices? Those would be the two questions. It's hard to pick among the 6 events, but maybe if I just explain what they are, that will help people make their own choices. So we have 3 evening events, which start at 7 p.m. UK time. So I think that's 8 p.m. Central European time at the moment.
Correct. Yeah.
And they're all cultural events, all centered on the music. So there's an opening gig. There's a remarkable piece of gig theatre called A Giant on the Bridge, which I'll explain in a moment. And then there's a closing gig. And the lunchtime events, which are all at noon UK time, so 1 p.m. CET, are more conventional webinars. And the arc of the whole festival is that we start by mapping and exploring the void that punishment creates, the gap that it produces between people, which is the re-entry challenge then that people coming back from punishment face. So we start with the negative, if you like, with the difficulty or with the problem. And then through the festival, we progress towards what we've learned about how that can be bridged, how we can create resources for building the bridges that people need to find their way into solidaristic social relations. So each of the conversations, we begin with the problem and how people react and resist. We move into the foundations for building bridges, and then the third event really tries to summarize what we've learned about how bridges are built. And similarly, in the evenings, the opening gig is mostly about the dimensions of the void that punishment creates and how people survive within it. A Giant on the Bridge weaves together the 5 separate narratives that explore these questions from different perspectives and combines those with songs from the project and some specially written songs in a really compelling and beautiful performance. That's also the longest event. It lasts about an hour and a half, I think. Okay. And there'll be some opportunity for discussion afterwards as well. And then the closing gig is more celebratory. It's basically saying, what have we learned about how we connect and how we can move forward together from here? So hopefully we end on an optimistic and upbeat note. Okay.
Last question, how can we find out more details?
Yeah, it's very easy. You can look at the social media. So I'm at Fergus_McNeill and constantly tweeting about the festival at the moment. But there's also the website of the project, which is www.distantvoices, all one word, .org.uk. So distantvoices.org.uk. And actually, the website contains lots of media and resources that people could use at any time. But there's a coming up subpage where all the event details are available. And there are Eventbrite sites for signing up to the different events. All of it's free, I should add. And many of these materials, certainly the 3 evening events, in due course will find their way onto YouTube, where they will live in perpetuity for people to use and enjoy.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fergus, for telling us more about Distant Voices Coming Home and the festival, of course. As Fergus said, for more information about the project, please visit the Distant Voices website and, of course, the CP website. Thank you for joining us.